Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Patrick Lovell coming at you on March 30th, 2023 at 8:30 a.m. my time. And I am just trying to sort through my mind all of the different formulas that could potentially trigger um, widespread acceptance, growth, fusion, um, connection, in which we all together begin to elevate what it is that I've been trying to reveal to you and saying outright for some time. And I'm trying to find the magic words that at times do better than at others. And, you've got to accept that in the space of trying to make something extraordinary happen. And fortunately for me, I come from a background where a lot of my life skills are oriented towards that because it's just the nature of my business and who I am. So, for starters, look, I have the evidence of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that has not ended. This crime has targeted and betrayed, set up, destroyed north of 50 million people in the United States and many tens of millions or more around the world. If you open up your feeds like I do every morning, 90% of what comes in my direction, and that's not a true calculation because I'm interested in a lot of things, and I wanted to touch upon that because I think it's important. But in the political space, in the reactionary space, particularly those at this moment, I mean, there's a lot of political turmoil and social unrest in countries like France because of what Macron's government has done with pensions. Apparently, the issue is that he has, and the government of France has, through austerity measures, decided to basically cut off 2 years of pensions to the French citizenry that, of course, paid into those pensions. And they're doing that to fund the government. Well, as opposed to increase taxes on the uber wealthy. And just like the United States and other democracies, so-called democracies around the world, which are not democracies, have been doing the same for some time. And the other unrest that has inspired me, and I've mentioned the last several truth bombs, is Israel. And I think Israel is incredible. And I hope that many, many, many of us can take away the lessons because you're seeing the professional class in Israel, doctors, accountants, legal I was about to say legal scholars, but just attorneys, people in the legal profession, pilots, every which way that there is somebody who is, accomplished in Israel. They're coming out to the streets with students and with younger people and with all sorts of other people, as far as I can gauge, and they are protesting against overreach by Netanyahu, which it's unfortunate that Netanyahu has been in power as long as he has. I keep reminding myself it's 2023, and he's been there for a very long time. But the issue in Israel is his corruption and the Supreme Court's ability to actually hold him accountable for that corruption, which he's using political maneuverings and behind the scenes leverage with, his sort of power vortex, if you will, to be able to overcome and manage the courts so that they won't be a challenge to him, which is an autocratic move, which is insane. And he was apparently speaking yesterday alongside President Biden at a global conference on democracies and championing democracies, which is ridiculous in terms of the far right sort of impetus of what's been going on in Israel post 9/11, which I'm very ashamed of and deeply disturbed by. And in other countries, I think obviously Ukraine and Russia is continuously in evolving into another sort of a amalgamation of confusion for the American people. Many people having very specific positions, and that's going to only get more tumultuous as we move forward. And I'm probably leaving out a couple of other hot spots, but that wasn't really the topic of what I wanted to address this morning. I want to bring it full circle, though, to that it's corruption that is in control of Western democracies. And I'm sure corruption's in, well, I can tell you corruption's in control of Russia And China, I don't know if you call it corruption if everybody's on the same page and there's an autocratic, top-down state capitalistic, maneuverings. That's more like, the dear leader, which is, I've always said in terms of the isms, there's not a lot of difference between capitalism and communism if you've got central power. They all operate the same way. Our structure of government and democracy writ large, the point is separation of powers. Most importantly, the point is the integrity of law, to hold power to account, which of course is on display in these countries and the social unrest. And we had our social unrest in a monumental way between Black Lives Matter and the MAGA movements, pre and post and during COVID, and more to come, I'm sure, especially if the economy goes sideways, which I'm expecting it will, based on a lot of the elements that I've been continuously trying to bring to your attention, as well as making the argument and informing you that everything now is an expression, an extension, a continuation of everything that I'm telling you that I have. And I don't need to just tell you. You can go look for yourself. It's all on display at the Con, www.thecon.tv. And then I also the new Untouchables on the Real Progressives, which you can view for free online. Just do a Google search for that. But I wanted to this morning to make the case, and I hope I don't go too long. I'm going to try to keep it as tight as possible, but really connect with you in a way that maybe I haven't yet, and I think I have in many ways. I don't know. Sometimes I get really manic because it's like one day I want to shout from the rooftops, like, what are you missing? Why aren't you listening? Do you know what's at stake, sort of thing. Then other days I'm just purely relaxed, where it's just kind of like, look, man, this thing's going to go the way it goes, no matter how hard I try to force it. And hopefully it's just the consistency of people, tuning in and maybe seeing me pop up on their feeds and listening and trying to understand who I am. And then suddenly, the light bulb goes on. But the big problem that we, all of us are up against is there's this sort of semi-permeable Teflon bubble of deception. It comes from our government, and it comes from our media, and it also comes from our judiciary. And the media side of it is the most beguiling because I am a producer. And so just kind of a quick background on who I am. Look, I came up in the 90s. I studied political science at Arizona State University. I was a pretty decent student in that particular field. In fact, I was very good in that field. And I've always been very engaged in history, engaged in the goings on of the world. I mean, I've always been involved with something every step of my adult life. And that's what led me to study political science. And eventually I was planning on becoming an attorney just like my dad, and I was planning on becoming a corporate attorney, but I just wasn't super inspired. So I traveled quite a bit after I graduated from college. During college, I traveled quite a bit. I traveled a lot. I mean, I've just always been an adventurer, and I love action sports. I love to skateboard and surf and ski and snowboard and climb mountains and all those kinds of things. And I've been doing that since I was a teenager, really. And and I played all sorts of team sports as well my whole life. I was very involved with football. I absolutely love playing football and rugby and that sort of thing. So, I love the notion of competition. And as when I graduated from college and I traveled a lot of places, I experienced a lot in life, my journey led me to going to Hollywood and to take a chance at my American dream. And I always thought to myself, you got to pick a lane, right? So I had this background of understanding the way the world works and always being curious, always being actively involved, pursuing my life. And I've always had just incredible interest in science, incredible interest in meaning and philosophy in the world. And I love this modern era where so much information is available to us and we can learn so much. And I think it's sometimes that I probably have more knowledge now, and I guess as you should, but I've never grown less curious as I've gotten older. In fact, I've only grown more curious. And there's so many fantastic arrays of information out there that are at our fingertips that just boggle my mind if you know where to look and search. But I'm also in complete disarray, like the rest of us. It's sometimes overwhelmed by the information and misinformation, but particularly in this point from mainstream media. Mainstream media has a vertical, and I know this as a producer, and I want to finish up with that real quick. I mean, so when I went to Hollywood, I ended up working as a small fish in a big pond. I got a chance because I was very ambitious to work in the offices of some of the biggest executive producers that exist in Hollywood, and I learned the business, and it was pretty amazing. But I was a tiny player, and I got tired of it because it was very hard and taxing, and there was a lot of things that would happen at that time period that were, I don't know, just problematic. Maybe my lifestyle was like B-list entourage, but at the same time, I was basically a slave. And I was a slave to powerful people that I didn't have a lot of respect for. I didn't like their lifestyle. I didn't like, their pressure. I never judge anybody by what they do, vis-a-vis, I'm all about liberty, what they want to, live in, but I believe in live and let live. And so, like, for example, just to give you an idea of some of the stupid pressure that I actually encountered in Hollywood, which was ridiculous. But it's like, I don't care what somebody's sexual orientation is. I never have. Go get crazy. Fuck. I don't have fun. Like I said, I was living a B-list entourage lifestyle that was more rock and roll lifestyle. Like fucking A, man. I love rock and rollers of Sunset Strip sort of thing, right? But the nature of conformity, if you will, within particular offices. I'll call it for what it is, man. I experienced, even though I didn't experience, but I was around the gay mafia, and they really expected you to play ball. And I've got a very strong personality, so I couldn't be conformed, but that was problematic for my career. And so they made things hard for me. They wouldn't let me get the opportunities that those who were, playing ball, and I mean that realistically, got. And I was resentful of that. And that was problematic because it was like reverse, I don't want to call it racism. It wasn't, anyway, it was just bullshit is what it is. And I couldn't stand that. And I would think of it like in terms of psychology and sociology and all of these different things. I'm like, fuck, this is just weird, right? And it was really ultimately problematic because I was working for a producer whose work was freaking spectacular and the best in the business. And I look back now and I'm like, Jesus Christ, if I would have stayed there, I would have probably gotten to where I wanted to go. But instead, I dropped out and I kind of rebooted and I became an action sports producer, and I got a job working in a small television station, and I grew from there, and I got involved with, doing a lot of entertainment. I was just at the right place at the right time, and I ended up producing a lot of incredible stuff with some of the biggest names in music and entertainment. I mean, I'll drop a few names like Green Day and Metallica and Robert Redford and Meryl Streep and Kevin Costner and Jennifer Aniston comes to mind, and so many others. Keanu Reeves was a big one for me. I actually interviewed Oliver Stone one time. That was pretty crazy. Anyway, so I did that for a number of years, but then I evolved and I became this producer on a national television show that happened to be involved with what created the 2008 Great Financial Crisis. And I didn't see that coming. And as I was moving forward in my career, being ambitious, being professional, doing those things that you do, I got married and had a family, and I got into my first house, and that's when my life rebooted in the most god-awful way. And I went through the 2008 Great Financial Crisis like millions of other people, and I got buried, and there was no way out. It literally felt like a tidal wave of calamity, and it just destroyed everything. And because of my background and what I mentioned to you, studying political science and being very active, and then going to Hollywood and seeing how real power operates, I knew how to ask questions. And in fact, that was my job. That's why I was doing production and entertainment and that sort of thing. I always asked questions. And so I pivoted a little bit, and I found a way to start asking questions about what it was that didn't make sense to me at the time, because I had known, and maybe it's because I've been behind the camera around a lot of powerful people and in boardrooms with a lot of powerful people, when somebody's lying. And I just knew the whole system was turning into a massive lie. And I was like, what is this? And so one thing led to another, and in the most sort of dramatic and desperate but miraculous way, I forged a pathway to find someone who would believed in investing in telling the truth. Now that story in its own right is amazing, and one day I'll share it. I don't want to go into too much detail now because I'm going further than I wanted to, and time is of the essence because there's a lot of stuff coming at you. But again, I want to reiterate why I'm telling you all of this, because I have the revelations and the evidence of the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in the history of the world that never ended, that has become our system, that everybody everywhere that are engaged in how things are working in the world are missing or bouncing off or don't have the capacity or for some reason are hiding. And that brings me back full circle to mainstream media. I knew in the time era of 2009, 10, 11, based on my experience, that mainstream media was lying or mainstream media was stupid. And quite frankly, to me, I didn't see a big difference. It was like it doesn't matter if they were lying or stupid. In either case, they weren't doing what we, as the citizenry in a democracy, depend on in the event that we hold power to account. That's the entirety of the system, because you have to have integrity of the law to be able to hold power to account. Otherwise, incredibly horrific and tragic things will happen. Now, in my process, literally, I mean, it was and still is the most challenging thing I've ever experienced in my life. And I've been at this now for 13 nonstop years. And what happens is that, you know, for those of you who have experienced this whole thing, you go through a process where you literally think you're crazy. You think there's no chance that what I'm experiencing is what I think it is, because we trust our institutions. And if, for example, media isn't telling us all of the things that I'm telling you, and it's not front and center. In fact, I had this experience recently where somebody had called me and they had watched the con and they said, my God, I was blown away. It answered every question I ever had. And I showed it to my children who are professionals and they watched it and they didn't believe it, because their whole point was, well, if this happened, we would have all known about it. And that's my point. The New York Times did a lot of fantastic work. There was a woman by the name of Gretchen Morgensen. There was William Cohen. There was other journalists that did fantastic work on this subject. Louis Story comes to mind. But they never put it all together. And I think, and I pretty much know why they didn't do it. It's a cultural thing. The New York Times is the nation's paper of record, is in Manhattan. So is our financial sector. A lot of these professionals in those two industries and law, they all work with each other. They might be family members. They literally, it's their city. And they never decided to, what's the term? Overturn the apple cart sort of thing. And it became a massive cover up. So Andrew Ross Sorkin, who was the lead editor, I believe, at DealBook, they came out with a documentary that he had written, and it was aired on HBO following the 2008 crisis, called Too Big to Fail. It was propaganda. It completely changed the story to facilitate the outcome. And quite frankly, the Obama administration was the surrogate or the benefactor of the whole thing, and they covered this up. And what is it that they covered up? Again, I continue to tell you that this is the largest criminal conspiracy and cover up in history that never ended. What you need to understand above all else is that because of the work that we did in the con, and because of the work that you can access in the new Untouchables, any of my truth bombs on YouTube or TikTok and everything else collectively, or just listen to what I'm telling you here, is that there was a methodology to a criminal racket, just like we're hearing right now with Donald Trump and all of the things that are happening and all of the different investigations. There's a methodology, and you're learning, even if you don't know about it through media, that there are laws to prevent things that Trump's done, and that's what he's being investigated for. Not fast enough. The DOJ has failed miserably in connection to Trump, but more's on the way. But he's one guy, okay? He's one guy who has become a problem because he is manifested, and because he's a chameleon, and because he's this Don the Con wizard of bullshit, is what he really is. And he has been his entire career. He found an opportunity and a willing participant to give the far right what they want and the Christian right what they want. And as Chris Hedges might refer to it, they have a Christian fascist sort of agenda, and particularly as it relates to the Supreme Court. And they've had willing participants in two different directions. Let's just say that that population has always been there my whole life, and probably going back to the very beginning of time, quite frankly. But like, for example, the Koch brothers, but the Koch brothers mostly had perfected techniques through think tanks, through universities, through verticals, and through marketing devices and everything else, that they could use their great financial power to skew public opinion, or at least a percentage thereof, to be able to get politicians elected and stay in power to do what it was that they wanted to maintain and increase their power. Now, interestingly enough, about the Koch brothers, they they were, obviously Charles Koch passed away last year or the year before, but the Koch empire exists, as does its vertical, and ultimately, it always amazed me that the way they were able to become as powerful as they were initially was because this libertarian family, father Fred Koch, I think, very involved with the what they call the Jim Birch Society, which is kind of version one of this far right, millionaire billionaire club that operates in this fashion. And but Fred Koch, he made his money by creating the infrastructure of the refineries for the Soviet Union. His main benefactor, his main client, was Stalin and communism. I mean, if that's a stream of consciousness, but I dare say that Stalin kind of didn't execute exactly, and I should be careful with that word because he executed millions, but executed the ideals of Marx and that sort of thing in a way that Marx probably had envisioned, of course, and same with Lenin for that matter. But absolute power corrupts absolutely, and there's not too much difference between the Politburo of that time period and our Congress today, quite frankly, because of these sort of interactions and these incredibly diabolical and brilliant on occasion, but manipulation through money that can buy the system. So it's just corruption. And you have a lot of complicit actors. And then when you have complicit actors that are smart, then this level of what they're able to do just becomes that much more sophisticated. But again, bringing back to the main point that I have spent the last 13 years based on my my life journey that got me to a point to be able to ask the right questions, and then to also have the capacity to go put it all together, that literally cost millions of dollars, to find out that the Federal Reserve used Federal Reserve Act 13.3 illegally to backdoor $30 trillion in 2009 to a bankrupted financial system on Wall Street that got that way through all of the things that we show you in the con, which was racketeering. We found in our journey in the con the only RICO conviction in the entire country that was for a smaller scenario that was like in the $60 to $80 million range. But we put all the pieces for you together in the con, and the way we were able to get there was because of the tragedy of an African American woman who was really the expression of the American dream turned nightmare, which is what we're involved with. Addie Polk migrated during the Great Migration because of the Jim Crow laws and everything down south to the industrial Midwest during the World War II era, where a lot of African Americans filled in the void of departing, white American soldiers for World War II to work in the factories. And by doing so, they were able to get their piece of the American dream, which put Addie Polk in her house for 4 decades until she became a victim of straw buying. Straw buying is just another scheme within millions of schemes that are on display in the con, where people could make up paperwork, basically act as if they were the owner of the house to take out loans. And then when the owner of the house couldn't repay those loans because they didn't know what was going on and they didn't pay those loans, nobody was there to help them. And then they got evicted because the system became such a train wreck calamity that they would come to evict, and the sheriff isn't guilty of anything other than doing his job. But the thing that led to that moment was just a complete diabolical train wreck of deception and criminality that then led to a foreclosing party that didn't have the right to foreclose, doing the paperwork within the machine because they were doing it on overdrive because they were all getting paid by the Federal Reserve largesse that ultimately I'm kind of getting the time period a little bit mixed up in terms of Addie Polk and ultimately what came down vis-a-vis quantitative easing. But the bottom line is everybody was getting evicted. A lot of people, particularly in African-American neighborhoods, and millions were targeted by this predation. And she faced the streets. And so she chose to commit suicide by pointing the gun at her chest and pulling the trigger. 5 times, didn't kill her immediately. She ended up in the hospital. I don't know how she had the constitution for that, but she ended up living for another 6 months and then dying. And since her house has been bulldozed into oblivion, where nobody will ever know what actually happened. And that's what happened to millions upon millions of people and Americans. So I'm in this process of trying to get your attention to build this populist crusade to purge corruption. Why? Because I have the answers. Literally, who am I? I'm just somebody you don't know in the sea of all of these people talking to you about, in some cases, a lot of very interesting things. In some cases, lies and deception. Depends on how you find me and depends on how you come here. I currently have north of 7 million views on TikTok that somehow didn't translate to YouTube. I don't know how that works. Algorithm thing is God, next level manipulation. But I do have 531 subscribers at the moment. And my ask to you is to like and subscribe and share this with 13 people. And I would like you also, for those of you who understand where I'm coming from and understand what I'm trying to do here, that has to build the absolute movement to take our country back. Because our country currently is not of, by, and for the people. It's of, by, and for the corporations that have pulled off corruption like you obviously have no idea about. Because if you did, I'd have millions of followers. We need, literally, my objective is 13 million followers, but we've got 531 now. If everybody, liked and subscribed and shared with 13 people and invested $13, the first thing I'm going to do is what I have been doing, but I want to do it at a much better level. I want to produce a podcast with Bill Black. The only reason I know all of this stuff was because back when I was going through the horrific, brutality of going through the foreclosure crisis in 2009 was really the year that happened, and it carried through 2011 for me, and that's when my journey really began. But I know I came across William K. Black miraculously on a Sunday morning on a program that Bill Moyers had on PBS, and Bill Moyers is a fabulous journalist and asked all the right questions. And suddenly I discovered Bill Black, and he was the only guy that suddenly made sense to me. As I mentioned, I've been in proximity to power. I've seen power lie. I've seen people manipulate stuff my whole life, but I didn't realize there's a system to it. And then when I discovered William K. Black and I found out that William K. Black was the hero of the savings and loan crisis. He was the general counsel at the Office of Thrift Supervision, and he worked with an incredible crack team that did investigations into that era, which was kind of phase one of what now has hijacked our nation. And this took place in the late 80s, early 90s. And he ended up writing a book called The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own One. And through that, he came up with this notion of control fraud. Now, Bill Black is not, then he was general counsel of the Office of Thrift Supervision, and he and his team put together 30,000 criminal referrals and he worked it with the media to be able to tell these stories. And the media started going, wait, why aren't there prosecutions considering what's going on? Next thing you know, they created a wave of like interest and then embarrassment. And the next thing you know, the DOJ and the FBI is doing their job, and they end up with 1,000 high-level prosecutions, and these fraudulent financial bankers and institutions not just went down, but they went to prison. And Bill Black, if he had moved forward, none of this stuff would happen. But unfortunately, Bill Black became targeted by what ultimately became the Clinton administration because they wanted to merge Wall Street with the Democratic Party. And they did so by deregulating our financial sector. And to do that effectively, they had to sideline the regulators, the police that would be able to hold it to account. They did that in the late 90s. We've been living with that over the course of the last, let's call it 25 years, even though it's longer than that. I mean, when you go back to the mid 80s, that's where we had Michael Milken, and we had the junk bonds and the Predator's Ball, and then we had the S&Ls, and that was all phase one of what is effectively late stage. I mean, some people call it late stage capitalism. I call it it's financial capitalism, which is suicide. It's predatory. It's predation. And these guys, this system, this entire industry, is a parasite. When most of us think of industry and then we think of markets and we think of business, we think of you establish a business, you create verticals, you get product to market. Maybe you bring something everybody wants, it's hot for a while, or maybe you bring something everybody needs. And if you're competitive and you have the best people working for you, sorry to sound like Donald Trump, if you create a vertical that then ends up making money and you have investors invest in that and they get dividends and the whole thing grows. I mean, that's the story of really industrial capitalism, but a lot of companies, including Hollywood, throughout the history of the United States, which has made us this global powerhouse. But since the 70s, we've been in reverse through financial capitalism, but it just got worse and worse and worse, and it literally devoured itself. It blew up the world in 2008. But what we didn't do was we didn't get the facts. We didn't hold it to account. We didn't get 30,000 criminal referrals. And by the way, the great financial crisis was 180 times larger than the savings and loan crisis. By the time we got to 2004 through 2006 through 2008, we were talking $600 to $800 trillion in derivatives. And by contrast, now we're over 1.2 quadrillion dollars in notional derivatives, and all on the everything bubble. There's a housing bubble, there's a automobile bubble, there's tech, there's everything else, and we've just been in complete turmoil for the last 18 months. But it goes back to like phase 4 of this whole thing. So in 2009, we provided $30 trillion. That's trillion. There's 1,000 billion and a trillion. The GDP of the United States is 25 trillion. It was unbelievable. And it led to literally, we know that there were north of 10 million foreclosures. There were 16 million filed foreclosures by 2012. And there's, mean average of 3 people per household. So that's 48 million people. And we know tens of millions of people more that were a part of, going back to what I said with France earlier in the conversation, pensions blew up because they were loaded with toxic dynamite that were used in fabricated lawyers' loans through predation, which we show you in the con at www.thecon.tv. And ultimately, while the world was in disarray and everybody was going down the tubes, we thought we were going to go into the Great Depression. And what we ended up doing, because the denizens of disaster worked with the complicit bastards from the Federal Reserve, ultimately were able to maneuver the Federal Reserve to do what the Federal Reserve is really designed to do: protect and fuel rich people. The stated purpose is, to have low employment or full employment and 2% inflation. But it's not. It's to hyperinflate assets and to maintain the power for the rich. And that's what we've done. We've provided since then, get a load of this, at least $70 trillion since 2009 into the financial system that use a whole variety of different schemes since 2009. Because what's going to happen if you allow the largest criminal racket in history to make shit tons of money on it they're going to do it again and again and again, which is what they've done. I could talk to you about zombie companies. I could talk to you about stock buybacks. I could talk to you about the NFTs. I could talk to you about the bubble that's about to collapse in the commercial real estate sector. I could talk to you about crypto and FTX and everything that's going on there. But more importantly, we just saw these bank runs. It's not more importantly, it's just all an extension of the Silicon Valley Bank, and then of course, Signature Bank and Silvergate Bank, and then the stuff that happened with Credit Suisse and more to come. It's just a continuation over and over of you getting jacked. And meanwhile, people are hanging on by their fingertips. We have $31 trillion in credit card debt. We're about to hit the credit ceiling because the Republicans are nuts and they don't understand the system. But at the same time, there are major concerns of international inflation because of global supply chains and monopolies and all of those types of things. But in the end, the summation is that you live in a tyrannical state. You live in a mafia state, by definition. I always describe it as corporate fascism undergirded by a criminal syndicate that uses socialism to fuel the mafiocracy, which in turn fuels fascism. I say corruption births fascism. And for those of you who believe in dignity, in integrity, in liberty, and sustainability, everything is on the line, and it has been for years. You just can't see the forest for the trees, which is why I'm asking you to invest $13 into this populist tidal wave crusade to purge corruption. Be aware, billionaires and multinational corporations, sum total, spend billions on making sure they own politicians so that they're not a threat with the power of the United States through its institutions, through the Federal Bureau of Investigations and the Securities and Exchange Commission that are all set up to prevent this from happening, as well as the Department of Justice, all which work to a tune of about $70 billion a year, that haven't been able to hold this to account because of revolving door and corruption. We all know it, but it has a face. It's not invisible. It's invisible to you until you see it. It was invisible to me until I put all of the pieces of the puzzle together. And I'm last man standing. And I've got access to all of the right people with the right stuff, which are the new untouchables, that can hold this to account if millions of us got behind to create this movement that has to come to the fore. And I hope, just like in Israel, it includes everybody in society, because you have to dig deep and understand history and understand where you came from. And I know there's millions of people that understand what happens when corruption takes grip and calamity ensues and something like fascism raises its ugly head. More misery. What are you hanging on to? What are you reluctant about? Why are you resisting the fact that I have the evidence? All you have to do is open the door. It's not a Pandora's box. It's the truth. It's the light of truth. You're standing in a dark room surrounded by faces yelling at you all of the misinformation, either intentionally or because they're stupid. But I did the work. I did. That doesn't make me part the Red Sea. That doesn't make me walk on water. But I am inspired by Exodus, and I am inspired by resurrection. That's what this is. Because the story of Moses was to create liberty to free the bondage of slavery. I love that story. That's the most amazing biblical story to me, because it led to, through Deuteronomy, the notion of the law and society, and no man is above the law. That's the whole point. And then resurrection. I mean, look, we're coming to that point again. I think Passover's next week, and that's what the Last Supper was for Jesus, who was a rabbi and who was purging corruption of his time. He was purging the Romans as well as the money counters. He was trying to resurrect the purity of what Moses infused through Exodus. That's the story of Jesus. And so those two Jews were about liberty and justice. Now, throughout several millennium, and a lot of different facets of how things and people interpret stuff, in the entire history of the Christian religion and pogroms and all of the other horrible things that come through humanity. I mean, this is just our chapter, okay? But everything's on the line. The democracies are on the line. Free markets are on the line, which don't exist. They're not free. They're monopolies. They're mafiocracies. And we're at a stage where we're faced with climate side. We're polluting ourselves to the point where, in my neck of the woods, I mean, for people that don't believe in climate change, as you can see behind me, there's snow all over the place. We've had an amazing winter, which never ends. And God, do we need the snowpack out west? But the bottom line is that's because the polar ice caps are warming to create the climate rivers and, the polar vortex. And that's the story. We know the science. It's not rocket science. And in the case of all of this other stuff, it's not rocket science, it's racketeering. And failure is not an option. My last name is Lovell. I'm originally from Texas. And I continue to think of this as, James Lovell and the crew of Apollo 13 trying to re-enter the atmosphere because they had technical problems and they had to reconfigure the systems to be able to have it function so that they could survive. That's what I'm trying to do constantly with these truth bombs to try to get your attention. And it's a righteous grind, man. That's all I can say. It's a righteous grind. It's very, very difficult to galvanize millions of people, which are necessary when they are listening and seeing and investing in everything while running away, but at the same time being aware. And it's just, I don't know, it's just a crazy society, man. Herding cats. And I'm not looking for cats. I'm looking for heroes. And I'll tell you, a bunch of people that have invested already. I mean, I want to give a couple of stories. There's this woman named Ashmeen out of Queens, New York, who was a Haitian immigrant, African American, and she invested in several homes. And one thing led to another. She got caught up in this whole thing, and she's been trying to, save her homes. And her children are professionals. I think one works at the National Security Agency, and the other somewhere else within the Beltway. But she's the American dream with the American nightmare, just like Addie Pulp. And then there's, I got wind of somebody who invested, was amazing. I got a $91 contribution, and I had said, look, I'm just looking for $13 contributions because I want really to have that be the catalyst. And I got this email from the person who did, and he said, no, that wasn't one person giving you $91. That was a group of 7 Mexican families who had lost their home to foreclosure. I know there's thousands of people right now in courts battling their asses off to try to get judges to see the corruption that has given the people that are bringing down foreclosure, they don't have standing because they've made up the document paperwork, just like President Trump made up the document to steal the election, for the electoral certifications. I said it in one of my truth bombs recently that Donald Trump is really an amalgamation, an expression of everything that this is, but he's one guy. He's really used all of the elements that we show you in the con and so forth. Yeah, I definitely talked a lot longer than I wanted to, but I've got to find a way to your heart. I've got to find a way to your mind. Nobody's going to save us. I heard last night, for example, that if you wait for institutions to save you, the battle is lost. Democracy is about the muscle of the people. It really is. And you have to be engaged. You have to be educated. You have to understand what this is all about. And so your $13 investment will go to the first side of it. If I can get 1,300 investors, I can get to a level where I can get registered for the presidential campaign, because I'll make this central to the presidential campaign. And then I'll create a podcast with William K. Black, and I'll be able to pay an editor or a podcaster, a guy who can bring these, so that we can give you professional podcasts. But it will continue to do the fundraising for a media that's going to give you the truth. Let's just put it that way. But eventually, what I want to get to, because I've got hundreds of hours of information and thousands of pieces of documentation fraud and all of this other material that I could put together to where we create a massive multimedia sort of revelation and presentation of what is actually going on. to stop this world dead in its tracks. And I plan on doing it as a national barn raising revival tour. Like we're Live Aid. I'm Bob Geldof. I'm bringing everybody together under one roof to lay all of this stuff out because everything is connected to it. Everything. Corruption in prisons, survivability, sustainability, all of it. I mean, this is truly exodus to resurrection. And failure is not an option. Sorry for all the themes, but that's true. And I don't know if history repeats itself, but there was certainly a lot of lessons we can all learn from the past and through fiction and from wherever we came from, but most notably our experience. And I know that there's 50 million plus Americans and 100 million people around the world that have experienced this. If I can get 13 million people, that would lead to a $169 million war chest to where we could do this barnstorming tour. But at the same time, we could create quite frankly, we could create a party that breaks the duopoly. Now, I would use the name Forward Party, but unfortunately, Andrew Yang and his guys have gotten that, and I don't know how forward they are. I've listened to them. I've connected with a bunch of them on TikTok or Twitter. Sorry, and they don't have a vision really. And if nobody's talking about corruption, then they can't get us to where we need to go. And so I come from a long line in terms of inspiration from the progressive movement in the United States, and also, quite frankly, from my lifestyle as a sports athlete. Progress is what it's all about. Same with science. Progressivism isn't communism, although many people would like to say it is. It's not. Progressivism is championing liberty and justice for all. It's the abolitionists through the labor rights movement, through the civil rights movement, through the environmental movement, through the women's suffrage movement. It's really everybody who doesn't want to be a part of the slave society. If you want a thriving, dynamic, fair society, there's a way we can engineer that easily. And I want you to consider that we've already spent $70 trillion on criminals. Could we spend $70 trillion to improve the world that we live in, our society? Are there enough smart people in this country that if they had the opportunity to work on real problems like the energy grid, that we wouldn't be able to solve that and create millions of jobs to create a renewable energy infrastructure? Yeah. And I'll tell you, the fossil fuel industry and the denizens of disaster and the parasites in finance and the corruption that it births, they're the ones standing in our way. They're the ones that are preventing in order to form a more perfect union. They're the ones who do not want democracy. They are a corporate fascist state undergirded by a criminal syndicate that fuels the mafiocracy that fuels fascism. Corruption births fascism. We cannot let this stand. Join me. Join today. Please spread the word. Please like and subscribe. Please contribute. Please invest $13. And together, we will win. Onwards and upwards.